My name is Mara Ellison, and I was 20 years old on the day my life ended. Or, more accurately, on the day I signed the papers that formally acknowledged its death. The pen felt unnaturally heavy in my hand, a cheap plastic thing that was about to cost me everything I had ever known. Across the polished mahogany table, Mark, my soon-to-be ex-husband, watched me with an expression of bored impatience. His lawyer, a man whose suit probably cost more than my first car, sat beside him, a thin, satisfied smirk playing on his lips. My own court-appointed legal aide looked tired, her shoulders slumped in a permanent posture of defeat. She had already told me it was the best deal I was going to get. The best deal was total surrender. The room itself was designed to intimidate. It was on the 40th floor of a glass skyscraper that stabbed the clouds, a monument to the kind of power and money I had briefly touched but never truly held. The air smelled of expensive leather and air freshener, a sterile chemical scent that failed to mask the predatory energy in the room. I signed the first page. The condo, with its floor-to-ceiling windows and views of the city I had once loved, was no longer mine. I remembered picking out the furniture with Mark, the laughter that echoed in the empty rooms before we filled them with our lives. Now, it was just a property, an asset, his asset. I turned the page. My signature slid next to a clause relinquishing my claim on our joint savings account. It was not a staggering sum by their standards, but to me, it was the world. It was the safety net I had so carefully helped weave, every penny a testament to late nights and sacrificed weekends. I had believed we were building a future together. I saw now that I was merely a temporary partner in a venture from which I was about to be unceremoniously ejected. Mark shifted in his chair, the soft whisper of his expensive wool suit, a sound of profound irritation. He had somewhere better to be. Another page, another signature. The car, the investments, the art we had collected, it all went to him. The legal language was a dense, impenetrable forest of jargon, but the meaning was clear. I was being systematically erased from the life we had built. My lawyer had explained it in simple, brutal terms. Because of the prenuptial agreement I had signed in a haze of love and trust at the tender age of 18, and because his family's wealth had been the foundation of our lifestyle, I was entitled to virtually nothing. The agreement was ironclad. My signature was just a formality, a final act of humiliation. Finally, we reached the last page, the appendix of miscellaneous assets. It was a short list. My personal effects, currently packed in 3 cardboard boxes sitting in a storage unit he had so generously paid for a single month, a small box of sentimental items, and then one final line item, almost an afterthought, the Cliffside property, registry number 77B41. Mark's lawyer, Mr. Davies, gestured at it with a flick of his pen. A formality, he said, his voice smooth as oiled glass. A piece of worthless, undeveloped land. Unbuildable, due to coastal erosion regulations. Kark. We've assessed it. It carries a tax liability, but has a market value of effectively 0. In the interest of a clean break, my client is happy to let you retain it. Mark chuckled. It was a low, condescending sound that scraped against my raw nerves. Think of it as a parting gift, Mara. A place to get away from it all. His eyes glinted with malice. The joke was clear. He was leaving me with nothing but a crumbling piece of rock and a tax bill. I looked at the description. The property. I had almost forgotten. It was not something we had acquired together. It was mine, and mine alone. A transfer from my father years before I had even met Mark. A strange, solitary watchtower on a remote stretch of coastline. My father, an eccentric and deeply private man, had bought it for reasons he never fully explained. He had just put it in my name when I was 16, with a cryptic comment about owning a piece of the sky and sea. He had passed away 2 years later, just before my wedding, leaving me with a profound sense of loss and a portfolio of unanswered questions. Mark had always dismissed it as your father's folly. I stared at the line, the only thing on the long list of assets that would remain mine. It felt less like a possession and more like a brand, a mark of my final, pathetic standing. The outcast, left with the one piece of junk nobody else wanted. I felt a surge of something hot and bitter in my throat. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw the pen in Mark's handsome, smug face. I wanted to rage against the injustice of a world where love could be a corporate transaction and a person's worth could be itemized and dismissed on a legal document. But I did none of those things. I took a slow, deep breath, the sterile air filling my lungs. I looked from Mark's smirking face to his lawyer's dismissive one. I met their gaze, holding it for a second longer than was comfortable. I let them see the emptiness in my eyes, but not the fire I was desperately trying to keep from being extinguished. I would not give them the satisfaction of my tears. I would not give them the drama they craved, the story they could tell their friends about the hysterical, broken little wife they had so efficiently discarded. With a hand that was surprisingly steady, I signed my name for the last time, Mara Ellison. The ink was stark and black against the white page. I slid the document back across the table. It came to a stop just before Mr. Davies's manicured fingers. "We're done," I said. My voice was quiet, but it did not tremble. Mr. Davies gathered the papers with a crisp snap. "Indeed. A copy will be sent to your counsel. I believe that concludes our business." He stood, as did Mark, who did not even bother to look at me again. He was already pulling out his phone, his thumb swiping across the screen, moving on to the next item on his agenda. I had been officially concluded. I stood up, my own chair scraping softly against the thick carpet. I did not offer a handshake. I did not say goodbye. I simply turned and walked toward the heavy wooden door. As my hand touched the cool brass handle, I heard Mark's voice one last time, dripping with condescending pity. "Hey, Mara," he called out. I paused but did not turn around. "If you need a little cash to cover that tax bill, just let me know." "I'm not a monster," his lawyer chuckled softly. The sound followed me out into the hall and echoed in my head all the way down the 40 flights in the silent, mirrored elevator. I was a monster. I was a fool. I was a charity case. I was nothing. The journey to the Watchtower was an act of pilgrimage to the monument of my own failure. It took 2 days of driving, my small, aging hatchback groaning under the strain. I drove through sprawling cities that bled into suburbs, then into rolling farmland that eventually gave way to dense, moody forests. The farther I got from the life I had known, the more the landscape seemed to reflect my own internal state, rugged, forgotten, and relentlessly grey. I subsisted on gas station coffee and stale sandwiches, the miles blurring together in a monotonous ribbon of asphalt and regret. I had only a few $100s to my name, the emergency cash I kept hidden away, a secret holdover from a life before Mark, when self-reliance was a necessity, not a choice. It was enough for gas and cheap motels, but not enough for a future. Each passing mile marker felt like a tick of a clock, counting down to absolute destitution. The Watchtower was not a destination. It was the end of the line. The final crumbling period at the end of a very short, very sad sentence. Late on the second day, the air began to change. It grew heavy with salt, and the trees became stunted and twisted, sculpted by a wind I could not yet feel. I followed a series of increasingly narrow roads until the pavement gave way to gravel, and the gravel gave way to a deeply rutted dirt track. My car bottomed out several times, the sickening scrape of metal on rock, a fresh assault on my frayed nerves. Finally, the track ended abruptly at a sheer cliff edge. And there it was. It was so much worse than I remembered. My childhood memories had softened it, painted it with a veneer of romantic mystery. The reality was brutal. The watchtower was a squat, cylindrical stump of grey stone, clinging to the land like a rotten tooth. It stood about 3 stories high, its crenellated top jagged and broken against the bruised purple of the evening sky. Rust-coloured streaks bled from iron fixtures down the weathered stone, like old, dried tears. The windows were dark, vacant eyes, most of them shattered, the remaining shards of glass grimacing at the encroaching twilight. I got out of the car. The wind hit me immediately, a physical force that stole my breath and whipped my hair across my face. It was a wild, lonely sound, a constant, mournful howl that seemed to rise from the churning sea below. The smell was overwhelming, the sharp, clean tang of salt mixed with the damp, earthy scent of decay and the faint, unsettling odour of wet, rotting wood. The ground around the tower was a treacherous mess of weeds, thorny bushes, and loose shale. A rusted, wrought-iron fence, intended to prevent falls, had mostly collapsed, its remaining posts leaning at drunken angles. With a sense of grim obligation, I walked toward the entrance. The door was a monstrosity of thick, weathered oak, swollen in its stone frame and bound with straps of blackened, corroded iron. A massive iron lock, the size of my fist, hung from a hasp. It was rusted solid. There would be no getting in that way. I circled the base of the tower, my sneakers slipping on the damp ground. The wind pushed at me, trying to shove me back, to send me away from this desolate place. I felt a kinship with it. I did not want to be here either. Around the back, facing the endless, turbulent expanse of the ocean, one of the ground floor windows had been completely smashed in. The opening was a dark, uninviting maw. It was my only way in. Hesitantly, I pulled myself up, careful to avoid the jagged edges of the remaining glass. I swung my legs over and dropped into the darkness inside. I landed with a soft thud on a floor cushioned by years of dust and debris. The air inside was thick and stagnant, a cocktail of mildew, dust, and the unmistakable scent of small, dead things. It was a smell of profound and absolute neglect. For a moment, I just stood there, letting my eyes adjust to the gloom. Faint light filtered through the grimy windows, illuminating a scene of total dereliction. The ground floor was a single, large, circular room. A thick layer of dust covered everything, disturbed only by the tracks of rodents and the drip of water from somewhere above. In the center of the room, a spiral staircase made of rusted iron clung precariously to the stone wall, ascending into the upper darkness. The floor was made of massive, uneven flagstones, coated in a fine silt of powdered mortar and dirt. Cobwebs, thick as cotton candy, hung from the ceiling in great, sagging chandeliers. In one corner, a pile of rotted sacks had spilled their contents, a dark, unidentifiable mulch. This was my inheritance. This was my parting gift. A cold, hollow shell filled with dampness and decay. The sheer, crushing weight of it all finally broke through my carefully constructed stoicism. My knees buckled, and I sank to the filthy floor, the dust puffing up around me. I wrapped my arms around myself, and I wept. I cried for my failed marriage, for the life I had lost, for the bright, naive girl I had been. I cried for my father, for leaving me this bizarre and terrible burden. I cried because I was 20 years old, completely alone, and the owner of a ruin at the edge of the world. The sound of my sobs was swallowed by the relentless moaning of the wind outside, a desolate duet of grief. I do not know how long I sat there, wallowing in the dirt and my own despair. An hour, maybe 2. Eventually the tears ran out, leaving behind a cold, hollow ache. The last of the daylight was fading, and a deep chill was beginning to seep into my bones from the cold stone floor. Giving up was easy. I could just get back in my car, drive until the gas ran out, and then, what? The thought was a terrifying blank. As awful as this place was, it was the only thing I had left. It was rock bottom. And from rock bottom, the only way to go was up. Or at least, The only way to go was to find a corner to sleep in that was not actively leaking. Fueled by a flicker of sheer, stubborn survival instinct, I got to my feet. I brushed the dust from my jeans and took stock. I had a sleeping bag in the car, a flashlight, and a few bottles of water. It was not much, but it was a start. I retrieved them, and with the beam of my flashlight cutting a path through the oppressive darkness, I began a more thorough assessment. I was not an architect, not a builder, but my father had been. He had loved old things, loved understanding how they were made. He had dragged me to countless historical sites, explaining the principles of a flying buttress, the genius of a Roman arch, the simple elegance of a mortise and tenon joint. Some of it, apparently, had stuck. I started on the ground floor, running my hand along the cold, damp stone walls. They were massive, at least 4 feet thick. The construction was cyclopean, with huge, irregular blocks of granite fitted together with surprising precision. It was built to withstand a siege or 1,000 years of Atlantic storms. Despite the decay on the surface, the core structure felt sound. The problem was the water. It was getting in everywhere. I ascended the spiral staircase, my footsteps echoing with a clang of rusted metal. Each step felt fragile, and I tested it with my full weight before proceeding. The second floor was much the same as the first, only with more evidence of water damage. A large section of the wooden ceiling, which was also the floor of the room above, was black with mold and sagged dangerously in the middle. Plaster had fallen away in huge sheets, revealing the lath and timber structure beneath. This was where the leak was, somewhere on the 3rd floor or the roof. The 3rd floor was open to the sky. A huge section of the roof had collapsed entirely, leaving a jagged hole through which I could see the stars beginning to appear. Rainwater had pooled on the floor, creating a shallow, stagnant pond. The wind howled through the opening, a wild and untamed thing. It was a disaster. The cost to repair something like this would be astronomical. Tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands. Money I did not have and would never have. Mark's parting words echoed in my head. If you need a little cash to cover that tax bill, the tax bill. I had not even thought about that. This place was not an asset. It was a debt, a millstone dragging me under. Defeated, I retreated to the ground floor. It was the driest and most sheltered part of the tower. I found a corner that seemed relatively free of drafts, unrolled my sleeping bag, and tried to ignore the scurrying sounds in the walls. Sleep seemed impossible. My mind raced, replaying the scene in the lawyer's office, the condescending smile on Mark's face, the crushing weight of this crumbling tower. It was a cruel joke. My father's folly, and now my prison. I spent the next 2 days in a state of grim, methodical motion. It was better than sitting still. I used a piece of rotted timber as a makeshift broom, sweeping years of dust and debris out of the broken window. I found a pile of old tarps in a rusted locker and managed to rig a temporary patch over the hole in the roof, a desperate attempt to stop the bleeding. It was a futile gesture, but it made me feel slightly less helpless. I explored the small, rocky beach at the base of the cliff during low tide, gathering driftwood for a fire I had no way of starting inside. It was on the 3rd day that I noticed it. I was sweeping the last of the fine, powdery dust from the flagstones on the ground floor. I was trying to clear a small area to create a space that felt less like a tomb and more like a camp. My makeshift broom scraped across the stone, creating a rhythmic, gritty sound. Scrape, scrape, scrape. But then, in one section near the center of the room, the sound changed. It was not a scrape. It was a hollow, resonant boom. I stopped, my heart giving a sudden, sharp thump. I swept the area again. Scrape, scrape, boom. There it was. A section of the floor, about 4 feet square, sounded different. It sounded hollow. I knelt, my knees protesting against the hard stone. I ran my fingers over the surface. It was a single massive slab of slate, perfectly fitted against its neighbors. There were no obvious seams, no handle, no keyhole. It looked exactly like the rest of the floor, but it sounded different. My father's words came back to me, a faint echo from a long-ago trip to a medieval castle. The best secrets, Mara, are hidden in plain sight. People never see what's right in front of them. They're always looking for the complicated trick. My pulse quickened. This was an anomaly. An irregularity in a place that was otherwise uniformly ancient and decayed. I examined the edges of the slab more closely. The mortar in the cracks was old and crumbling, just like everywhere else. But as I picked at it with my fingernail, a small chunk came loose, and underneath, the line was too clean, too perfect. This slab was not set in the same way as the others. I needed leverage. I scanned the room, my eyes falling on a long iron bar leaning against the wall, probably an old poker for a fireplace that had long since crumbled away. It was heavy and rusted, but it was solid. I jammed the tip into the clean crack I had discovered and pushed. Nothing. I put my entire weight into it. The bar groaned, and the stone did not budge. It was sealed tight. Frustration gnawed at me. Was I imagining it? Was this just another dead end? Another false hope in a place built of them? I sat back on my heels, breathing heavily, hidden in plain sight. What was I missing? My eyes scanned the room again, from the floor to the ceiling, along the curve of the massive stone walls. And then I saw it. It was so small, so insignificant. I had looked at it a dozen times without truly seeing it. On the wall, about 3 feet from the floor, was a single, small iron hook. I had assumed it was for a lantern or a coat, but it was different from the other rusted fixtures. The metal had a slightly different sheen, and it was located directly in line with the edge of the hollow-sounding slab. I approached it cautiously, as if it might be a trap. I ran my fingers over it. It was cold and solid. I tried to turn it. It did not move. I pulled it. Nothing. I pushed it. Still nothing. Then, remembering the spiral staircase, I tried pushing it upwards. It resisted for a moment, and then, with a low, grinding click that echoed in the silent room, it moved. It slid up about an inch. And across the room, with a deep, groaning shudder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the tower, the edge of the massive slate slab lifted by a fraction of an inch. A gasp escaped my lips. It was real. It was a mechanism. My father, the engineer, the lover of puzzles and secrets. This was his language. This was his design. Adrenaline surged through me, a potent cocktail of fear and elation. I scrambled back to the slab. The iron poker was now just wide enough to fit into the gap. I wedged it in deep and heaved with all my might. The stone was impossibly heavy, but it moved. Slowly, inch by agonizing inch, accompanied by the shriek of stone grinding against stone, I lifted the slab. I managed to raise it enough to prop the poker underneath, holding it open. I peered into the darkness below. A rush of air, cool, dry, and smelling faintly of ozone and old paper, washed over my face. It was a stark contrast to the damp, mildewed air of the tower. This space had been sealed for a very, very long time. My flashlight beam cut through the blackness, revealing a set of steep, narrow stone steps leading down. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat of disbelief and hope. With my flashlight held out like a sword, I descended into the earth beneath the tower. The stairs opened into a small, perfectly square room, no more than 10 feet by 10 feet. It was lined not with rough stone, but with smooth poured concrete. The air was still and cold. In the center of the room, sitting on a low wooden pedestal, was a large steel footlocker. It was not rusted or decayed. It looked clean, almost new, and on top of it, placed dead center, was a single, thick, cream-colored envelope, sealed with a familiar wax stamp, my father's initial, a stylized E. My name, Mara, was written on the front in his distinctive, sharp handwriting. My hands trembled as I reached for it. The paper was crisp and cool to the touch. For a moment, I just held it, the physical proof of a message sent across the years, from a man I had missed more than I had ever allowed myself to admit. I sank to the floor of the cold, secret room, and, with a deep, shuddering breath, I broke the seal. The letter was several pages long, every line covered in his familiar script. "My dearest Mara," it began, "if you are reading this, then several things have happened. First, I am gone. For that, my girl, I am endlessly sorry. Second, you have found yourself in a place of difficulty, a place so dark that you were driven to the very edge of the world, to this old tower. And third, you have proven yourself to be exactly the woman I always knew you would become, resourceful, observant, and too stubborn to be defeated by a little dust and decay." Tears welled in my eyes, blurring the words. I wiped them away impatiently and kept reading. "I know this tower seemed like a burden, perhaps even a cruel joke. I assure you, it is the furthest thing from it. It is your fortress, your inheritance, and your weapon. I could not leave you money, Mara. Money is too easily taken, too easily squandered by those who do not respect its value. Instead, I left you something far better. I left you the ground beneath your feet." My eyes darted from the letter to the footlocker. I set the pages aside for a moment, and, with trembling fingers, I undid the latches. They clicked open with a satisfying modern sound. I lifted the heavy lid. I was not prepared for what I saw. The chest was packed to the brim. On the very top were neat paper-banded bundles of cash, $100 bills. I lifted one. It was heavy, dense. There were dozens of them. I could not even begin to guess how much was there. Hundreds of thousands, at least. Enough to fix the roof 100 times over. Enough to live on for years. Beneath the cash, there was more. I lifted out a thick, leather-bound portfolio. Inside were official-looking documents, geological surveys filled with complex charts and impenetrable terminology. There were core sample analyses, water purity reports, and something called a spectrographic mineral assay. I did not understand most of it, but certain words and phrases leaped out at me. Unprecedented purity, significant deposit, rare earth minerals, and artesian aquifer of exceptional quality. Tucked into a side pocket of the portfolio was a sheaf of legal papers, title deeds, mineral rights contracts, water rights licenses, all ironclad, all filed and registered to the property, and all under one name, Mara Ellison. My name. He had not just given me the land, he had legally fortified it. At the very bottom of the chest, I found a small velvet bag. I opened it and poured the contents into my palm. A single, heavy, oddly shaped key made of brass, and a small, folded piece of newspaper. The key was a mystery, but the newspaper clipping was dated just over 2 years ago, a few months before my wedding. It was a small article from a business journal, announcing a new junior executive appointment at a rapidly expanding real estate development firm called Apex Holdings. The smiling, confident face in the photo was instantly recognizable. It was Mark. A cold dread, colder than the concrete room, washed over me. I turned back to my father's letter, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the pages steady. I picked up where I had left off. The ground beneath this tower, my dear, is special. It sits atop one of the purest, largest untapped artesian aquifers on this entire coast. Furthermore, the granite bedrock itself is laced with a concentration of rare earth elements that make it phenomenally valuable to the tech industry. I discovered this by accident years ago, and I have spent a fortune since then quietly and legally securing every possible right to it. This land is not worthless, Mara. It is a treasure trove, and I was not the only one who knew. A particularly aggressive company, Apex Holdings, has been trying to acquire this land for years. They knew its value. They made me offers, veiled threats. They tried everything they could to take it from me. When I refused, they began to watch me, to probe for weaknesses. And they found one. They found you. The words on the page swam before my eyes. My breath hitched in my chest. It could not be. I am so sorry to be the one to tell you this, Mara. The young man you fell in love with, Mark, was not a chance encounter. He was an assignment. He is an employee of Apex Holdings. I have had him investigated. His entire life, his courtship of you, it was all a meticulously planned corporate strategy. They could not take the land from me, so they planned to take it from my heir. They intended for him to marry you, to gain your trust, and, through the mechanisms of marriage and divorce, to legally strip you of this one single asset they so desperately coveted. They counted on you being young. They counted on you being in love. They counted on you signing whatever was put in front of you. They dismissed the tower as worthless in the legal proceedings, because the last thing they wanted was for you or your lawyer to investigate its true value. It was the perfect, silent heist. The letter fell from my fingers. The air in the small room was suddenly suffocating. I could not breathe. My marriage, my love, the life I had mourned, the man I had adored, it was all a lie, a fabrication, a long, cruel corporate maneuver designed to steal a piece of rock from a girl who did not even know what she had. The humiliation in the lawyer's office was not just the end of a relationship, it was the successful conclusion of a business deal. Mark's parting shot about the tax bill was not just an insult, it was the final twist of the knife, the victor's casual cruelty. A new feeling began to displace the shock, something hot and sharp and utterly ferocious. It was rage, a pure, cold, clarifying rage. They had not just taken my condo and my money, they had taken my youth, they had taken my trust, they had hollowed me out and left me for dead. They thought they had won. They thought I was a broken little girl who would crawl away and disappear. They had no idea who they were dealing with. They had no idea that my father had left me more than just land and money. He had left me a plan. I picked up the final page of the letter. They will come for you, Mara. Now that the divorce is final and the land is legally yours, they will try to buy it. They will start with a lowball offer, something that seems generous to a person they believe is destitute. They will be friendly, then persistent, then threatening. Do not sell, not for any price. In this chest, you will find everything you need. The cash is for your immediate security and to hire the best legal counsel you can find. I recommend a woman named Eleanor Vance. She specializes in environmental law and corporate malfeasance. She was my lawyer. She is a shark, and she is loyal. The key is for a safe deposit box in the town of Northwood, which contains my complete file on Apex, including evidence of their other illegal acquisitions. Use it. This is your fight now, my girl. They underestimated you. They underestimated me. And they underestimated the bond between a father and his daughter. Make them pay for their arrogance. Build your life on the ground they tried to steal, and make it a fortress they can never touch. I love you always, Dad. I sat there in the silent, secret room for a long time, the letter in my lap, the evidence of my father's love and foresight surrounding me. The grief was still there, a deep, resonant ache. But it was now intertwined with something else, something powerful and unyielding, purpose. My father had not left me a ruin. He had left me a battlefield, a war chest, and a declaration of independence. The tears were gone. The despair was gone. In their place was a resolve as hard and as cold as the stone walls of the tower. The game was not over. It had just begun. The next morning, I walked out of the tower, and into the pale light of dawn, a different person. The despair had been burned away, replaced by the cold fire of my newfound purpose. I was no longer a victim. I was the inheritor of a legacy, the executor of my father's final, brilliant plan. My first move was to secure my position. I took one bundle of the cash $10,000 and drove to the nearest town, a small, wind-beaten fishing village called Port Blossom. The bank tellers looked at my dusty clothes and my wad of hundreds with suspicion, but the money was real, and they opened an account for me without further question. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I had resources. I was not powerless. Section. From there, I found a small motel, one that was clean and anonymous. I paid for a week in cash. The hot shower felt like a baptism, washing away the grime of the tower and the lingering scent of defeat. I looked at myself in the mirror. The face looking back was still mine, 20 years old, pale, with dark circles under the eyes, but the expression was different. The fear was gone. In its place was a hard, determined glint. My next call was to the lawyer my father had named, Eleanor Vance. I found her number online. Her firm was based in the city, 300 miles away, a world away from Port Blossom. I expected to get a secretary, to be put on a waiting list, but when I mentioned my father's name, I was put through almost immediately. Mr. Ellison's daughter? Her voice was crisp, professional, and held a note of genuine surprise. He spoke of you often. He said you were the cleverest one in the family. He left me a message, I said, my voice steady. And a situation. I need to hire you. I'm listening, she said. I spent the next hour on the phone, explaining everything. The divorce, the tower, the hidden room, the contents of the chest, and the name Apex Holdings. There was a long silence on the other end of the line when I finished. They are vultures, Eleanor Vance said finally, her voice laced with a cold anger that mirrored my own. I've had run-ins with them before. They specialize in what they call distressed asset acquisition, which is a polite term for preying on the weak. Your father was right to be paranoid. This scheme with your ex-husband, it's audacious, and it's exactly their style. My father said you could help. I said, help? She laughed. A short, sharp, humorless sound. My dear, for what they did to you, and for the respect I had for your father, I am going to help you dismantle them, brick by brick. Do not speak to them. Do not answer any calls. Forward any correspondence to me. I will handle everything. Your job is to stay put and stay quiet, and find that safe deposit box. Hanging up the phone, I felt a massive weight lift from my shoulders. I was no longer alone in this fight. I had an ally, a shark. 2 days later, as predicted, the first call came. It was a blocked number. I let it go to voicemail. The message was from a man who introduced himself as David Chen from the acquisitions department at Apex Holdings. His voice was smooth, friendly, almost gentle. He said he understood I was the new owner of the Cliffside property, and that his company had a long-standing interest in the parcel for a small-scale eco-tourism project. He was prepared to make me a very generous offer to take the unusable land off my hands. He offered $50,000. $50,000. A week ago, that sum would have seemed like a king's ransom. It would have been enough to change my life. I laughed out loud in my empty motel room. They had no idea. I forwarded the message to Eleanor. Her reply was a single text message. The first mouse nibbles the cheese. Ignore it. My next task was the safe deposit box. Northwood was a sleepy inland town 100 miles away. The key my father had left me was for a small, independent bank, the kind with a marble lobby and tellers who had worked there for 30 years. Using the identification I still had, and the key that felt like a sacred object in my hand, I was led into the vault. The box was long and thin. The bank manager slid it out for me. Inside was a single, thick manila folder. I took it back to my motel room before I opened it. It was my father's dossier. It contained copies of internal Apex memos, leaked by an anonymous source. There were sworn affidavits from other landowners they had swindled. There were financial records showing a pattern of shell corporations and illicit transactions. But the most damning thing was a project proposal, codenamed Project Bedrock. It was a detailed plan for the acquisition and exploitation of my property. It outlined the immense value of the water and mineral rights, and it named the key personnel on the project. The project lead for personal asset acquisition was Mark Ellison, my husband. There was even a budget line for expenses related to the courtship and marriage. They had budgeted for my love. Seeing it there, in black and white, in the cold corporate language of a project plan, was somehow more devastating than my father's letter. This was the playbook for the destruction of my life. I carefully packed it all up and shipped it overnight to Eleanor Vance. A week went by. Apex called again. This time, David Chen's voice was a little less friendly. He said he was surprised not to have heard back. He said the offer was a generous one, and it would not be on the table forever. He upped it to $100,000. I forwarded the message to Eleanor. Her reply, "They're getting nervous. Good." Meanwhile, I used the time and the money to start rebuilding. Not my life, not yet. But the tower. I hired a local contractor, a grizzled old man named Silas, who had been building on the coast for 50 years. I showed him the tower. He whistled, low and long. "She's in a sorry state, miss," he said, kicking at a loose stone. "But she's got good bones. Your father built this right, or whoever built it 100 years ago did." "My father owned it," I corrected gently. "He loved it." "He had good taste," Silas grunted. "Fixing this won't be cheap." "I'm not looking for cheap," I said. "I'm looking for it to be done right. I want it to be a fortress." He gave me a long, appraising look, then a slow nod. "A fortress. I can do that." Work began immediately. Silas and his crew were masters of their craft. They swarmed the old tower, their movements efficient and sure. They repaired the collapsed roof, using reclaimed timber and slate that matched the original. They repointed the entire stone exterior, sealing the cracks against the wind and rain. They replaced the shattered windows with new reinforced glass that could withstand a hurricane. I paid them every Friday, in cash, from the seemingly endless supply in the footlocker. As the tower was being physically restored, Eleanor Vance was going on the offensive. The third offer from Apex came not by phone, but by registered mail. It was a formal legal document. The offer was now $250,000, and the language was no longer friendly. It hinted at legal action, at eminent domain, at the prohibitive costs I would incur fighting them. Eleanor's response was a masterpiece of legal warfare. She did not just refuse the offer. She filed a countersuit. On my behalf, she sued Apex Holdings, Mark Ellison, and their entire board of directors for fraud, conspiracy, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. Attached to the lawsuit, as Exhibit A, was the Project Bedrock proposal. As Exhibit B, my father's dossier. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The lawsuit, with its salacious details of a marriage orchestrated for corporate espionage, was leaked to the financial press. Apex Holdings in Honey Trap Scandal, read one headline. The company's stock plummeted by 40% in a single day. Their board of directors went into an emergency session. Their carefully constructed public image as a dynamic, forward-thinking company was shattered. They were exposed as predators. David Chen called me one last time. His voice was no longer smooth. It was a panicked, ragged squeak. "Mara, please," he begged. "We can settle this. Name your price. $1 million, $2 million. Just call off your lawyer." I listened to him plead, my heart as cold and hard as the new stone in my tower. "My price," I said slowly, "is that you and your company burn to the ground. You have my lawyer's number. Do not ever contact me again." I hung up the phone. The downfall of Apex Holdings was swift and brutal. The lawsuit triggered federal investigations. Their illegal practices came to light. The board fired the CEO. Several executives, including David Chen, were indicted. Their lines of credit were pulled. They were forced to start liquidating assets to cover their mounting legal fees and cratering stock price. They were ruined. And Mark, my ex-husband, he was fired, of course. He was named in the lawsuit, his reputation destroyed. His wealthy family, embarrassed by the public scandal and facing their own financial exposure from their investments in Apex, cut him off completely. He lost everything: the condo, the car, the money. The life he had stolen from me was taken from him in turn. The irony was so profound it was almost beautiful. His own greed, the very tool he had used to ruin me, had become the instrument of his own destruction. A few months later, the tower was finished. It was no longer a ruin. It was magnificent. The stone was clean and strong. The roof was solid. The windows gleamed, reflecting the blue of the sea and sky. Inside, it was warm and dry. I had kept the rough, rustic feel, but it was comfortable, solid, a home. My fortress. I had moved the footlocker and my father's letter up to the top floor, the room that was now a study with a panoramic view of the ocean. One crisp autumn afternoon, as I was sitting in that room, watching the waves crash against the rocks below, a car appeared on the dirt track. It was not one of the contractor's trucks. It was a battered, decade-old sedan, a far cry from the luxury vehicles Mark used to drive. It parked where my own hatchback had once sat. A man got out. It was Mark. He looked terrible. He had lost weight. His expensive suit was gone, replaced by worn jeans and a faded jacket. His face was pale and unshaven. He looked lost, and years older than he was. He walked slowly toward the tower, his eyes wide with disbelief at the transformation. He stopped before the new solid oak door, the one with the new unrusted lock. He just stared at it. I went down the spiral staircase, my footsteps now making a solid, reassuring sound on the firm metal steps. I opened the door. He flinched, as if the sound was too loud for him. We stood there for a moment, the cool sea breeze blowing between us. "Mara," he said. His voice was a hoarse whisper. I can't believe it. What did you do?" "I rebuilt," I said simply. He looked from my face to the magnificent tower behind me, his expression a mixture of awe and utter confusion. "How? The money, the lawyers. I heard you took everything from them." "They took nothing from me," I said, my voice even. "They only took what they thought was valuable. They were wrong." He finally seemed to understand. A flicker of his old arrogance sparked in his eyes, quickly followed by the dawning horror of his own monumental miscalculation. He had been a pawn in a game far more complex than he had realized, and he had lost spectacularly. "You set me up," he accused, his voice rising with a pathetic, desperate anger. "You and your father. This was all some kind of trap." "It was a test," I corrected him. "And you failed. You and everyone you work for." The anger drained out of him, replaced by a raw, pleading desperation, the kind I knew so well. I had felt it myself, on the floor of this very tower. "Mara, please." He begged, taking a step forward. "I have nothing. My family won't even speak to me. I lost my job. I lost everything. You have to help me. We were married, for the sake of what we had." I looked at him, at this broken man who had orchestrated my ruin, with a smile. I felt nothing. No pity, no anger, not even satisfaction, just a vast, cold emptiness where my love for him used to be. I thought of his last words to me in that office, the smug, condescending offer that had been intended as the final nail in my coffin, and I knew what I had to say. I met his pleading eyes without flinching. "What we had was a lie, Mark, a business transaction, and your investment went bad." I let the words hang in the air for a moment, sharp and cold as the salt spray. Then I gave him the faintest, coldest of smiles. "If you need a little cash to declare bankruptcy," I said, my voice soft and clear, "you just let me know. I'm not a monster." The flicker of recognition, of remembered cruelty, in his eyes was all the victory I needed. Before he could respond, before he could say another word, I stepped back inside my fortress. I closed the heavy oak door. The new latch clicked into place with a solid, satisfying finality. the sound of a lock turning on the past. I locked him out, and I locked my future in. I was home, and I was finally, completely free.